I want to ask you one or two questions about how you grew up. What made you get interested in history?
Yeah, I wish I knew. When you're young, you think you know a lot, but of course you know nothing. And it's only with time that you realize how little you knew. But you're very confident as a young person. The thing I had going for me was my mom was a big reader, and she would take out books from the library and in bulk, several at a time.
Oh,
And one of the areas that she liked a lot was historical fiction. And so she would bring them home and they'd be sitting around the house. And occasionally I would pick one up and because she was done with it and I had to go back to the library. So there was that. But on the whole, besides my mom's influence, which was not forced on me, not imposed on me, but just indirect through the books that she took out and read, I was really a science and technology kid when I was growing up, not a reader. And so I loved math. I loved physics and bio and chem. And that's what I did mostly in high school
right.
and what I thought I was going to do at university. So I went to university for STEM and spent the whole first year doing almost all STEM courses. I I was in a program that after 2 years admitted you to medical school instead of the usual 4 years. And I did very well in organic chemistry, which was the hardest course. If you passed through
Sure.
organic chemistry, there was a chance you could get onto the path for medical school. But organic chemistry mostly crushed people and ended their aspirations. I did well. I moved on. I got into this molecular biology class, which was a seminar for 12 people, very exclusive. And part of it was in the hospital. And if I had to go to an operation, and back then they had a carotid artery operation where they cut open your neck to scrape the plaque that had built up in the carotid arteries that threatened a heart attack. Now we have Lipitor and other
Right.
generic versions of Lipitor, statins, which remove this plaque and reduce the risk of heart attack. Heart attack risk is way down as a result. But back then they didn't have them yet. So when I saw the operation in the hospital, I got a little queasy from the blood and I passed out. And it ended my medical career quest. You're right, exactly. And I foolishly gave up the science in addition to the aspiration to go into medicine. I didn't have to. I could have just stayed as a scientist doing research in a lab in any of the various fields I was interested in. But I just gave it up, so disappointed, gave the whole thing up, and I went into British poetry, wrote my senior thesis on John Milton, did a lot of Shakespeare. But crazily, the concentration in English at the school I went to had a requirement that you did 8 courses in your concentration and then 4 courses in an allied field. And so I said to my advisor, well, I didn't know that. And he says, well, you need 4 courses in an allied field now to finish the major, the concentration. And I said, well, I have 4 semesters of math, and the math that I did is like poetry. There are no numbers in it, right? It's topology and all this fabulous math because I was a math kid. And he said, no, that's not considered an allied field for English literature. You have to take some history courses. So I took almost all history courses immediately the next semester, and they were fabulous. And then I did it again, and then I did it one more time. So I had a history major in addition to the English major before finishing, only because I was told I needed an allied field for English. And then I went on for a PhD in history. So if you had looked at me at any point in the trajectory I was on, you would not have predicted, despite the fact that my mother read historical novels, historical fiction, you would not have predicted that I would have ended up on that path. So therefore, accident, contingency.
Yeah. And recalibration.
Yes, are really important for the way that I write history, since that's how I came into the history field myself.
Amazing. But you started studying the history of France before you switched on to that of the Soviet Union.
I had a lot of great influences on me, fortunately. University of Rochester, where I did my undergraduate work as a STEM kid and then switched, had a nice roster of fantastic historians. They had Christopher Lash in American history, Eugene Genovese in American history, and one of my favorites, William McGrath, who did Central Europe, Western Europe, and Central Europe. So they were my primary influences, America and Europe. And I ended up going to Berkeley for a PhD in European history. And I started in French history because every American had this.
Con ingredientes 100% naturales. Literal, nunca perdamos nuestras buenas costumbres.
Sort of goatee, cafe society, leftist politics.
Yeah.
And so French history was by far the most popular at the time, especially at Berkeley. This was 1981.
Right.
And so 18 students were in the first year French history seminar that I was in. But I was not on the left, didn't have a goatee, and I've never had a cup of coffee in my life. So French history didn't really work with me. You know, my first major assignment was a paper on the Paris Commune, which was a leftist seizure of power during the Franco-Prussian War in Paris that was not supported by the Parisian countryside and was overthrown by force. And I did a critical analysis where I didn't support the Paris Commune seizure of power, and everyone was a little bit shocked. Really? I said. So French history wasn't really for me, and then I moved into the Central Europe, Habsburg history stuff, and that was really exciting, but there was no major mentor, and I started learning the Russian language in my third year of the PhD program, which is the time you're supposed to take your exam, and instead I started learning Russian alphabet that year, and then I took intensive Russian for quite some time. And 4 years later, I was assistant professor of Russian history at Princeton University.
Why Russia?
You know, so it's hard to say exactly, but when I was in Habsburg history, I studied Czech language, one of the major nations and languages in the Habsburg Empire, German, Hungarian, Czech. Even though it was a dual empire, the Czech part was very substantial. And so it was my first Slavic language Czech. And I got to Prague in the summer of 83, maybe, for the first time. And I was behind the Iron Curtain, saw a communist regime, and it was incredible how interesting it was. It was nothing like the stereotypes that we had growing up in the US about the system. Everything was great on the outside, but on the inside, there was this fabulous entrepreneurialism and resistance to communist way of life and trying to create your own way of life inside the limitations of being stuck with the censorship and the lack of travel permission and everything else. But the people were very inventive. And the system was alive as a black market, second society, secondary economy, inside the formal structures that were hard to see. But when you lived there, you understood how exciting and interesting and inventive the whole thing was. So it was very oppressive, of course, but it was also, it had this entrepreneurial, inventive side. And so I thought, that's interesting. And then I had a teacher. I was very fortunate. Many Europeans came to Berkeley in the 80s. So I met, for example, Habermas, Jacques Derrida, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and Michel Foucault. And so I was a student of Foucault's. This is me and Michel Foucault in my house in Berkeley.
You look a little bit younger.
I was 40 plus years younger. But anyway, he said to me at lunch one day, he said, wouldn't it be great if someone studied used my analysis of power to study the Stalinist system? Because he had applied this theory of micropower to the Western system, Western Europe, especially France. But how does it work for a totalitarian system? So I thought, yeah, that's really exciting. I was young, impressionable, 20-something years old. I didn't share his view that Western society was kind of like a prison or imprisoning in many ways, that the Enlightenment was a negative thing entirely, the 18th century European Enlightenment. But I love the way that he was able to connect individual identities and behaviors in a micro setting with the larger structures of a system. So this little tactics of the habitat, actually a phrase I got from Michel de Certeau, who was another French intellectual, came through Berkeley, was very exciting. So on the one hand, Foucault's prompt to use micropower techniques to study Stalinism, and on the other hand, my trip to Prague, which had introduced me firsthand to what the Iron Curtain, what such a system was like in practice. And so I was very enthused. I didn't have a home. The Habsburg history wasn't working because I didn't have a thesis advisor at Berkeley. And so why not? There were these fabulous Russian history professors there, Martin Malia, who was the main influence on me, and Reginald Zelnick, both of whom were my thesis advisors, were very prominent professors in Russian history. So that was the piece that was missing in the other areas that I was studying. And then these influences. And so I started learning the Russian language. And lo and behold, I had an amazing teacher of Russian who was an emigre who came out in the East. He came out through Siberia in the revolution, his family. He was 80-something years old by the time he was at Berkeley, teaching a very accelerated Russian to a handful of kids who needed to learn Russian from scratch like me. Sergei Kotkin. And he had been a translator of Mongolian. He wrote a Mongolia dictionary. He worked for British intelligence in the Far East, in New Japanese. Yep. And so he had this amazing East Asian piece that was unusual for Russians. And so he had stories like you couldn't believe. World War II and Intel and just Asia in general. There's a huge influence on me. I was there to learn Russian.
Sure.
So grammar and vocabulary and sentence structure. And so I took accelerated Russian with him a whole semester, but 1 year. So 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. I considered a year's worth of college Russian in a semester. The second semester was a second year's worth of college Russian. And then the third year of college Russian, I took in the summer in Leningrad in 1984. So I had 3 years of college Russian in a single calendar year, mostly thanks to Sergei Kotkin, and then thanks to this summer language program in Leningrad, where first time to the Soviet Union, Konstantin Chernyenko was the general secretary. The place was clearly stagnant and everything else, and I experienced that firsthand. But I had enough Russian so that after just one calendar year, I was able to start reading with a dictionary coming back from the Soviet Union in that fall of 1984, and embarked soon enough on dissertation research, finished my dissertation a few years later, and then started at Princeton University, my first job. Where
89, right?
Yeah, September 1989 at Princeton.
33 years you were there.
Yes, and the wall fell in November in my first semester. The Berlin Wall fell. So I just caught this wave, this wind, from that molecular biology class where I fainted in my own vomit on the floor of the OR. From that through Shakespeare and Milton
to the fall of the wall,
and all in just a really short period of time. The French intellectuals at Berkeley was just fabulous in the 80s. And so I was really lucky, really privileged things just kept falling my way. Gorbachev happened. I chose to study the Soviet stuff in before Gorbachev, remember. So I'm there, Konstantin Chernenko, learning Russian in Leningrad.
Yeah,
and then the Gorbachev thing happens.
Wow.
So it was one thing after another that I got very lucky, extremely lucky, but it was not foreseeable. Looking back, it makes sense. I can tell a story that seems to make sense. But looking forward, prospectively, it was like, what was I doing? Where was I going? And so life is like that. You have to be ready to be lucky.
Mm.
You have to perceive these moments of good fortune and seize them and take advantage of them.
So you believe in luck?
I'm living embodiment of luck, for sure. Hard work, no substitute for hard work, but a lot of people work hard. Not everybody has good luck. Some people have the other kind of luck.
You had a quite a number of lucky events earlier on, right? But you're one of the few that have written so much about not just Stalin, but Russia, the Soviet Union. What has changed? And I want to put this in the context of how I'm seeing so many people don't understand each other. Right? You've written so much, but what is it that the Americans need to have a better understanding with respect to Russia?
Yeah, this is a problem of big countries.
Yeah.
Big countries are so big, they can get self-absorbed in their own story. And their own story is substantial. It's really large, right? American history is consonant with global history at this point. That's not how American history is written for the most part. It's not studied and written as global history. Yeah. It's studied and written in a nationalist, sort of navel-gazing, internal view, even though America's effect on the world is colossal. This is true of the way China works. It's true to a certain extent the way Russia works, although Russia is somewhat different because it had this giant Eurasian continent folded in to its story. America had an assimilation approach so that lots of newcomers became American, wanted to become American as soon as possible. My generation, I'm fourth generation American. So, in other words, my ancestors came a long time ago, before the First World War. My father's side from Belarus, my mother's side from Poland. But by the time it got to me, nobody was speaking foreign languages at home, right? Already the second generation was extremely eager to assimilate, become as American as possible. And so by the time it got to me, there was almost nothing left of the origin story. And so Russia's a little bit different because folding in the Tatar Khanates and folding in all sorts of other peoples, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, the Caucasus. Russia had a larger world than just Russia inside Russia for a really long time. It was much more of an empire in its mentality and makeup than the US or China were in terms of their Sinification in the Chinese case and Americanization in the American case. That's not to say that they're completely Sinified or completely Americanized, right? There's an ability to retain one's culture, one's language, one's identity inside a larger story. But that's much more prominent in the Russian case. But nonetheless, it's typical of places like America to think that America is the world. And so the American version of English, American institutions, American food, American way of life, that either the whole world is like that or it has a desire to become like that. Yeah. And so that's just wrong, right? The whole world is not like that, and it doesn't have a desire to assimilate into some larger global Americanism. So it's something you got to push against. Yeah. You got to get out there in the world. Yeah. You got to live in foreign countries. You got to learn foreign languages. You got to live and learn to think like the people who are not Americans. And this goes for any culture, any part of the world. It's very valuable. And we don't do enough of that because America is too big, too self-contained, too self-satisfied on occasion.
Is-
We don't
is-
encourage it enough. We encouraged it after we got scared
Yeah.
with the Soviet Union sending up the first artificial satellite in 1957, the Sputnik, a couple of years before I was born. And so America had a panic and invested massively
Yeah.
in trying to understand the rest of the world. That was really beneficial for several generations.
Yeah.
But now we need that again. We need that boost again, where we all want to send our young people
Yeah.
out there so that in the formative years, they begin to understand just how big the wide world is and how it's necessary to have empathy with how other people live
I like
and
that.
work and think and,
Yeah.
and their viewpoints. And
We lack empathy.
empathy is the hardest thing to achieve,
Yeah, you've been talking about that,
but
quite
it's
a
the
lot.
most powerful.
Is that doable though? The
Yes.
ability to send a bunch of one country citizens to the rest of the world, and
Sure.
vice versa,
Sure, it's
to have a
possible.
better
It
understanding
just
of each
doesn't
other's
happen.
culture.
You're right. It doesn't
Yeah.
happen naturally.
Yeah.
It doesn't just happen automatically or organically,
No.
Gita, right? You have to be proactive.
Yeah.
You have to encourage it. So both of my kids are in college now. And I try to let them find their own way,
Yeah.
not to make them, not to use them as guinea pigs for disappointments in my life, to make them do some of the things that I didn't do,
Yeah.
or not to make them do exactly what I did,
Mm.
right? So encourage, facilitate, but don't impose on them. But it turns out that one of my kids, who's a chemistry and economics double major, decided he wanted to go to France. He learned French in college, and he went to France for study abroad.
Yeah.
Now he speaks French. He loves French culture, and he understands America much better as a result. And our daughter, who's 2 years younger than him, who does visual arts, anime, poetry, creative writing. So very different profile, but she's also very enthusiastic about Japanese culture and wants to do her study abroad in Japan.
Wow.
Now, mind you, my wife is a South Korean passport holder. Right? My wife is Korean. So the kids grew up with Korean school and Korean culture. On the weekends, they went to Korean school and they got introduced to K-pop and other influences besides the language.
And K-dramas.
Yes. And my wife was chief curator of the Korean art section at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so she did a number of really gigantic Korean related exhibitions. And we had Psy from Gangnam Style come, and the kids met Psy and took videos with him. So they had some international
That's really
influence.
good.
But nonetheless, they took the initiative themselves, like my son to do the French stuff and my daughter to do the Japanese stuff. And we think that makes them much better Americans and much deeper understanding of America.
Yeah.
We travel with them as much as we can. Tourist travel. Usually I'll be invited to give a lecture or attend a conference. And my wife will come along to do museum work. And the kids will tag along just to see what that culture is like. So we've done some family travel that way, opening up vistas for them, but not telling them, again, that they should do this or they should do that, but showing them what's possible. And so we think that that can be done.
Yeah.
Of course, we have resources now. When I was growing up, we weren't rich, and I was a working class kid. And first time I traveled abroad was a subsidized trip for language study to Vienna when I was in graduate school at Berkeley, where they paid my way to go study at the Goethe Institute in Austria to study German. But now that I've worked really hard and got lucky and been rewarded, we have some resources to be able to travel. And my kids started traveling much earlier than I did, traveling abroad. But now, as part of their studies, so it's really exciting, and we can do more of that. It's important to bring it here,
right,
and have it available inside American culture. And we do have a gigantic population of immigrants, green card holders, foreign students. And it's indispensable for our economy, and I would argue indispensable for our way of life. But we also need to get the Americans out there.
Yeah.
And especially the ones who are going to be in decision-making capacity, officials, positions of authority.
Yeah.
It's not just that they got to have passports and plop down at some 5-star hotel in luxury and spend a couple of days there talking to some brilliant people who got a PhD at Harvard or MIT or LSE, right?
Yeah.
Not that kind of travel abroad.
Let them go to the villages, the trenches and all that.
Yeah,
right?
see how the transport system works, see what the school system is like, see how ordinary people live with families around the world and how they think and what their aspirations are.
You alluded to a song by Sam Cooke. Don't know much about history. I get the sense that the kids nowadays, they tend to, over social media, communicate amongst themselves, to themselves, as opposed to their predecessors, the 107 billion people that have died. We call that history.
Yeah.
Isn't it a concern that the kids nowadays don't study history the way you did or most of your peers did?
So, yeah, we have a lot of complaints that our young people don't know history.
Yeah.
And so I say, well, whose fault is that? Is that their fault? Or is that our fault as history teachers? We have to do better. We have to teach a history. We have to write history and teach history in ways that attract their attention.
Yeah.
It's on us, not on them. You can complain till you're blue in the face, walk around the Stanford campus, oh, they don't know any history. Well, do something about it.
Yeah.
Teach them some history, but in a way that sparks their curiosity, sparks their desire to learn more when you're not there anymore, right? So I'm not a complainer about people not knowing history. I try to be a doer about that.
Yeah.
But that's true not just of our young people. That's true of people in positions of authority.
Yeah.
What I've discovered in my travels and in my advisory capacity with private sector or public sector officials is that the demand for history is really high.
Yeah.
It's not a demand problem. It's really a supply problem. When I go to Washington or other government institutions, our allies, Five Eyes, they're all dying to know history from me. That's all they ask me about, historical. How did it happen the last time? Or, what are the lessons? What can we learn from previous episodes? So demand for history in the government sectors is huge. Same thing I discovered in the private sector.
Yeah.
Okay, there, sometimes the history is financial history, economic history. The tech people want to know how innovation works.
Right.
They want to know history of technology and history of science. And so demand is off the charts. It's just we're not supplying the big picture history, the tour of horizon, the connect the dots, the history that is exciting and gives you insight into how the world works now and where it might be going. What the drivers of change are. History never tells you what the future is going to be. Nobody can do that. But what history can tell you is that the present's not going to last.
Yeah.
That things are going to change because that's happened many, many times over, right? Who living in China in the 1960s or 70s was going to think that China was going to be the second largest economy in the world, right? Per capita GDP was $200 a year under Mao. And so if you projected that forward, you would have looked like a fool.
Yeah.
Because the China that unfolded was nothing like that time period that people were living. So you got to do that with your own time period, with your own set of institutions, with the reality that seems permanent.
Right.
Because it's the reality that you live in, and you got to say, it's very likely it's going to change. I don't know how it's going to change, but it's going to change. And therefore, let's be ready for the changes. Let's even try to shape the changes somewhat. And so what are the levers of power, the levers of agency onto large systems?
Right.
How do you affect change? Not giving a lecture, giving a speech that something should happen.
Yeah.
But how could it happen?
Yeah.
What role does agency play? And can do that if you understand systems,
Yeah.
systems theory, complexity theory, and if you understand the drivers of change. So history is really empowering for agency. Yes, there's perverse and unintended consequences often. You think you're trying to invent one type of world and you get the opposite result because you don't understand how nonlinear causality works, and you get these perverse and unintended consequences. Sure. But nonetheless, history is enormously empowering if you take it seriously and study it well, for you to understand the could and therefore how to intervene. And not to assume and project forward, right? So you take the models for climate or the models for economic growth or all those models have built-in assumptions that are then projected forward 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And we know that those projections are bunk. Because if you look at the previous projections, they were generally off. Right? The ambassador of the UK in Germany in the 20s. So Germany is a great power. The UK is the biggest power in the world in the 1920s. And this ambassador is not a dumb guy. And he writes this report that Adolf Hitler is finished as a politician. He's done. He's toast. And a few years later, he's chancellor of Germany. Not because the ambassador was a moron, but the ambassador was projecting forward from the circumstances in which he was living, not understanding larger dynamics at work that became visible retrospectively. And so how do you see some of that prospectively? Right? Once again, there's contingency, there's accident, there's a lot of things that you didn't think were going to happen, and then, wow, they happen, right?
I like how you've always compared yourself with the economist, who would always use the assumption everything else being equal.
Economics is a very powerful profession. I like economics a lot. I studied economics. I have a lot of friends who are economists. Their models are very impressive. But they always have that line in them, just like you said, Gita, right? All other factors held constant, comma, and then you're off to the races with this economic model. In geopolitics, nothing is held constant. And so we have this policy advice that goes like this. The economists are dominant. Economists have the ears of officials. Economists have the ears of policymakers. And then one day, bad stuff happens. And everyone discovers that people are not maximizing utility. They're murdering each other. And so then the geopolitics gets let back in, right? And all of a sudden it's geopolitics 24/7, geopolitical risk and all sorts of great power, rivalry, this and that. And the economists for a time get eclipsed because we're not maximizing utility. We're having war or there's a pandemic or whatever it might be. But that's wrong also. That's another extreme. So economics is really important. Prosperity, trade, opportunity, right? So it's peace and prosperity. It's geopolitics and economics, and we can't let one occlude the other just because it seems to be a happy time or just because it seems to be an unhappy time, right? So I try to keep a balanced perspective, knowing that it's never as good as people say. It's never as bad as people say. Economics is just as important as geopolitics, even when it doesn't seem to be the case, and vice versa.